Welcome to Live from Plato's Cave. I am Mario Veen. This is episode 22, World-Centered Education with Gert Biesta. In this podcast, we have discussed different interpretations of Plato's allegory of the cave for 21 episodes. I've talked with philosophers, physicists, geologists, political scientists, artists, food experts, and other experts about how they read Plato's allegory of the cave. In this way, I want to offer you an educational resource that you can use to study whatever interests you in your life. So we take a different perspective each time, and Plato's allegory of the cave gives us a structure to come back to and to ask certain questions about this. But what does Plato himself say that the allegory is about? If you remember from episode 1, where Masha reads the entire allegory, he introduces it in this way.
Compare the effect of education and the lack of it on our nature to an experience like this. Imagine human beings living under the earth in a cave-like dwelling,
etc. So Plato uses the allegory to say something about education. But what is education? In the allegory, Plato uses the word paideia. It's usually translated as education, but you can translate it in different ways. It's much broader than our current conception of education. So it can be translated as upbringing or as a combination of cultural development and maturity, becoming a grown-up person in all senses of the word. Our guide today, Gert Biesta, criticizes the narrow sense in which we understand education in our society today, in which it's seen as a system for producing learning outcomes and a function of society. We will discuss his latest book, World-Centered Education, which was published this year, in which he writes, educational questions are fundamentally existential questions. That is, questions about how we try to exist as human beings, how we try to live our life in and with a world that is not of our making, and that is under no obligation to give us what we want from it or expect from it. Gert Biesta is Professor of Public Education in the Centre for Public Education and Pedagogy of the Maynooth University in Ireland, and he is Professor of Educational Theory and Pedagogy at the Moray House School of Education and Sport of the University of Edinburgh in the UK, where he is also Deputy Head of the Institute for Education, Teaching and Leadership. Gert has published many books about education. For instance, Good Education in the Age of Measurement, which came out in 2010, and The Beautiful Risk of Education, published in 2014. And he has also been involved in educational policy. For instance, in the Netherlands, from 2015 to 2018, he was a member of the Onderwijsraad, the Educational Council in the Netherlands. Well, Gert, thank you for being willing to speak with me about your book, World-Centered Education.
My pleasure.
I read it with a lot of pleasure. You've written many books already. I should know this, but how many books have you written?
I've lost count. I think I've sort of written as a single author about 10 or somewhere in that range, and I've edited a lot and some co-authoring. Yeah.
I really appreciated that it's not a very big book. It's about 100 pages.
Yep.
Very concise, and it really goes to the core, so to speak. And you address some very fundamental. So the book is about education, obviously, but you address some very fundamental questions like what is our basic relationship with the world around us? What is attention? Very existential issues. And my first question is, why is it necessary to go so deep in order to say what you have to say about education?
I think, first of all, that's to do justice to education, I would say. I meet a lot of people who think education is something practical and something easy. And when you begin to ask questions, then people say, well, you don't do difficult, or they say, oh yeah, that's philosophy, or it's abstract. And I find that odd, because I think education is one of the most important things we do as human beings with each other. It's, in a sense, fundamental to everything. So it deserves, I think, really deep, if we can use that word, engagement, but careful engagement. And I think when you begin to do that, you see that there are quite big questions that require nuance. I think that's what I've been doing throughout my work, and each time you get a little closer, or you find better language to say the things you want to say. This is sort of the fifth book in what started out as a trilogy, but now it's a quintet. And I think, yeah, I also feel that I've managed to go to some really core questions about education. And I also hint in the book that I say, maybe I'm not going to write the sixth book. So I'm also thinking, well, if readers don't get it, this book, then there isn't much for me to add to it. Yeah.
Yeah. One of the things I appreciated is that I really appreciate when you see in thinkers or philosophers, when they say, well, actually, first I thought this about something, but now I have maybe a deeper understanding or a different understanding. And this is what you do several points in the book.
I also find it quite interesting that a lot of people are involved in education. They do all kinds of things. And of course, a lot of that goes fine. So it's not that it's impossible to teach without all this theory. But it's quite remarkable that when people talk about what they are doing, what they say is such a misconnection with what is actually happening. And I think that's also why I go to some, quite big discussions about what actually is teaching, and how is teaching fundamentally different from learning. Whereas most people, I would say, no, it's all learning, and there are sort of teachers, but well, one day the internet will replace them, or artificial intelligence. And then I think, no, wait a minute, the teaching and being taught is a really profound and complicated phenomenon. So it really deserves to, I think, to go into that. And also, I think there are a lot of other disciplines that claim that they can tell what's happening in education. There are countries where sociology is very influential. Other countries where there's a lot of psychology. And again, I think psychology and sociology have interesting things to say, but it's really, important to always go back to say, does this really speak to the reality of education? Or does it become a different discourse? So, I think all those things have gone into the book in order to say, can we say in a very precise manner what we're actually doing all the time, where I think that the language we use is not really precise. And the precision matters, I think. So it's not just that it's precision for people who like precision, but I think it also matters for how we think about teachers. If we say, well, teachers are just there to facilitate learning, but students don't really need teaching, then I think very quickly you begin to devalue teachers and all the work they do. So it also has political consequences.
Yeah, one of the things that struck me is that, of course, you can take any object or any subject in the world and go very deep into it and ask the most basic questions about it, like how do you walk, or something like that. But you don't really need to, unless it really interests you. But I think how you lay it out in the book is that in order to really do justice to, let's say, the potential that education could have in our world, we do need it, because if you have this worldview where people are basically brains walking around, and you just have to see what's the most efficient way to put information in the brain so they will, do their work with as much efficiency as possible. You get a certain type of education, whereas when you have a different worldview, you get another type of education.
Yeah. And the brain is an interesting example where there are a lot of people who think, oh, if we just have better neuroscience, we'll get better education. And then I just remind people that Putin also has a brain. So it's not the brain and how it functions, but it's what we do as human beings with our brains. And I find that remarkable, that some of these promises, like, if we know how the brain works, then we have everything we know for education, or people who say, if we know how memory works, then we have the basis for education, because education is just about memorizing knowledge and then being able to reproduce it. Again, what it misses is the fact that I always have these extreme examples, but then I would say, of course, Hitler also had a memory, and that also worked according to particular psychological laws. But that's precisely not the point of education, that we can memorize. The question is, what do we do with our memories, and how do they make a difference?
Yeah. It seems Plato already knew something about education as well.
Yes.
When in the cave allegory, he says that it's not about putting sight in the eyes that cannot see, but it's about a kind of turning.
Yeah, I think so. When you invited me for this, I already warned you that I'm not a sort of a Plato specialist, but I said it's funny that precisely in this book I go back to Plato on this fundamental insight that where he says, what we do in education is not to produce the sight of our students or the perception of our students. The work of education is to turn their attention in a particular direction. And I think that's a profound insight. It already gives an answer to everyone who is too excited about psychology, because all the psychology tells you sort of how the hardware works, but what we do with it, in which direction we sort of try to put that whole psychological apparatus, that's the educational question. You can even say, and that's the context in which I do it in the book, that's the basic form of teaching. It's constantly, you can say, redirecting the attention of our students in all kind of ways. And that's quite a special process. If you walk into a shop and you try to do that with the people queuing at the till, it would be silly. They probably call the police if you do it. But if you do that in a school, then you have a context where you say, that's the work we do. We meet a new generation and we say, have you seen that? Have you paid attention to that? Shall we spend an hour or a year or 4 years or whatever to really go deep into this? So there is a really interesting connection with Plato there.
I first want to ask another question, but we can go into that. Just to say that this, I haven't really talked about Plato in this podcast that much, but what I like about it is that the allegory of the cave, you don't need to know anything about Plato, and people know it. It's kind of like I wouldn't maybe go so far as to call it a school, but it's kind of an architecture where you can walk around, you can discuss it. And because this is an audio podcast, people are walking around or they're falling asleep or they're gardening or doing whatever while they're listening to this. I thought, well, this is kind of an image that everyone knows already, and it provides a common ground. And it doesn't really matter what Plato meant any more than how, for instance, The Matrix or another movie used
Yeah.
it. Those are two kind of interpretations and ways in which you can do something with it. And of course, I do have to do an episode about Plato's philosophy at one point. But yeah, so this is episode 22, and yeah, education for me is the thing I get most excited about to think about it. And I think every episode so far, in one way or another, it comes back to education. For instance, we discussed with geoscientist Marcia Björnerud about how what is lacking in our society now to adequately face the climate crisis is a literacy in the field of geology. We have some ideas about geology that are really outdated, and anyway, that has a lot to do with the way education is organized in society as a whole. Just as one example of how, for me, everything comes back to education. And so the main, I guess this is the first time I asked the main question of the podcast, because it's a very broad question, so I hesitate to ask it. But how do you see growth and development and learning in this world? Very broad question.
So yeah, that's a funny question, because I would start by saying these three words have nothing to do with education. And it's the problem of a lot of discourse and practice around education that it constantly keeps using these three words. So I actually in the book say development and learning are the two most uneducational concepts I can think of, and growth is somewhere there as well. So I should explain that, of course, because there is something behind that question. For me, the main point of education is, I would say, education is first of all a verb. So it's something educators do. And I distinguish that from processes. And I think growth and development and learning, in a sense, are processes for me. So we cannot deny that living organisms like human beings grow, that they develop over time, that they change as a result of the interaction, the environments they are in. But all that for me is not education. It comes back to Plato, who would probably say, yeah, we cannot put growth or development or learning in human beings. That will happen. The work of the educator is to ask the question, now in which direction should this growth go? What is a desirable development? What's an undesirable development? What's worth learning? What isn't worth learning? And also, how can we make sure that it's not constantly us as educators who answer those questions for our students, but also how we can encourage our students that those questions will become their own questions. So for me, that would be the briefest way to say these terms in themselves, for me, are not educational terms, because they lack a sense of direction. So my blunt examples, all the criminals in the world have grown, have developed, have learned, but they ended up doing unwise and horrible things with that. And you can say the real question is, what do you do with your own growth and development and learning? And how do you figure out what is worthwhile doing? And I think as educator, we sort of stand sometimes in front of our students, often a bit on the side of our students, to say, have you seen that? Have you considered your growth in relation to those options? So that's where I have you could say, a quite specific understanding of education. But for me, the point is important because I see so many people talk about education in these terms, where they say the work of the teacher is to support student learning. And if I was told that that's my job as a teacher, I wouldn't know what to do, because I know that my students' learning can go in any direction. Or in the Dutch law on primary schools, it says each child has the right to an uninterrupted development. Again, I can't understand how you can make education out of that.
That's funny because you emphasize that education is an interruption.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
Because, development, again, can go in any direction. And sometimes you see students going in beautiful and wonderful directions. But sometimes you really worry, and then you have to step in as an educator and say, wait a minute, where is this going?
So is this idea of a student as a like a plant or something, or a flower that is growing, and the job of the educator is to water it and to like that, make sure it gets enough sunshine, protect it against the wind maybe, and then it will just grow by itself.
Yeah. And so again, it's an interesting metaphor, because a lot of people say education is a process of cultivation. And again, I get worried when I hear that, and I think, yeah, we cultivate plants, and we know that not all seeds can become anything, and we cultivate a plant in a particular way with light and shade and water and fertilizer. But that's not the way of us human beings. We are not plants with, you can say, particular pre-programmed outcome. We are, in a sense, undetermined beings. We have an open future. And therefore, rather than to be cultivated, again, I would say the work of education is to begin to remind children, young people, of the openness of their future. And therefore, both the possibility to give a direction, but also the need to do that. And that's very different, I think, from how we cultivate plants.
Yeah, because if you cultivate plants, you are waiting for crop. It depends on how you do it, maybe, or even if you grow flowers in your garden, maybe you want to produce something like enjoyment or a nice view or something like that. So you kind of have in mind already where you're going with this.
Yeah. And of course, the plant also has in mind where it's going.
Yeah.
And yeah, what we do with plants is to make sure that we get the best out of what's in the plant, which does not necessarily mean that we get the most out of it. So sustainable farming really wants to make sure that plants can do well, rather than that they are just pushed for crop. But that's a very different process from how we as the existing generation meet the new generation. And that's one example where I see so many people who talk about cultivation and flourishing in the context of education, and then I think, well, wait a minute, is this really the right language? Is this the right metaphor, or are we missing something when we use that language?
And what are we missing?
I would say what we are missing is, how shall we call it? These are big words: human freedom, the openness of human futures, or the indeterminacy of how human beings grow up. And that's where you can say, when you say education is cultivation, it means that you will approach your students in particular ways. You will sort of put fertilizer in front of them, which can be books or culture or whatever. That's not unimportant. But the cultivation metaphor sort of reaches its limit, where you suddenly acknowledge that there is a human being who can say yes to what you put in front of them, or know, and who ultimately have to make up their own mind.
So this is one of the points where you get very fundamental. You have to get very fundamental, because then it becomes a question of what is a human being.
Yeah.
Or at least a human being in the context of education.
Yeah. So it's partly about what we are assuming about human beings when we educate. And yeah, that's where I think those assumptions and the language we use make a difference. So one thing I do in the book, I always also, I'm a bit, what is it? A bit playful. So I like to find interesting examples or things to play with. So in the book, I talk about two paradigms of education, and the one I call this cultivation paradigm. And then I have another paradigm, and the word paradigm we can, of course, discuss, which I call the existential paradigm. The point I try to make is to say, if we only think about our students or about education in naturalistic terms, in terms of biology and organism environment interaction and all these ways of thinking that partly come from biology, psychology, but never ask the question or never even have a sense that as human beings we are originators of our own action. We have agency, we have freedom. We can say no, which I think is really important. That I think most animals cannot say no, but we human beings can, and there we encounter our freedom. And when the student says no to us, we also encounter their freedom. That, for me, requires sort of a very different educational paradigm, or a different set of assumptions, or a different idea of the sphere in which we are working. And yeah, what I do in the book is go back to a paper actually from Einstein and colleagues, who asked the question whether the prevailing theory in physics, whether that is complete. And in a sense, I ask the same question to education and say, are the prevailing theories we use in education complete, or are they unable to capture this moment of human freedom and agency? And there is quite a fundamental critique then to think, well, education is just applied psychology, or it's just applied genetics, or just applied neuroscience, because all that can never sort of give a place to the question of freedom and the strange phenomenon that we can say yes and no.
Yeah, I'm reminded of this line from a poem by Khalil Gibran, The Prophet. It's, I don't think many people know that book, but that's actually about raising children on children, I think. And the first line is, your children are not your children.
Yeah.
And I think many of the theories that you name that are, well, they're used a lot. I'm an educational researcher. I know that. I see there are all these theories about this is the kind of professional we want to have, if it's about a profession, and what are the pathways to achieve that.
Yeah.
But for me, the danger is that it all hinges on the idea that we know, let's say we're 18 plus at least, that we know what's best for the children, that we know what they need, and that we know what the society that they grow up in will look like, what it will need from them and everything. And I think that if we look around us, particularly, in this day and age, we don't really know so much. We're not, if you look just because of the title World-Centered Education, if you look at the world, there are many big problems in the world, and we haven't figured them out yet. Does that connect to I'm trying to connect to what you're saying about this opening up, but let's say as a teacher, you want this opening up to happen, but you don't have the answer yourself. You don't have
Yeah.
But
so
at
was,
sorry, but so at the last thing, at the same time, so you want to open up, you want to acknowledge that there is freedom, but at the same time you say that part of your job is to make sure that you don't just grow in any direction, but in a certain direction. So is there a paradox there, or how does that work?
There is a paradox, and you can find this paradox again in the history of education and up to the present day, where people say, well, it's one or the other. Either we as educators decide what children should know and how they should develop and who they should become. And then people say, well, but then you completely constrain and eradicate the freedom and the future of children. So we shouldn't do that, and rather we should give children all the opportunity to grow and develop and play and discover. So you have this pendulum between child-centered education, which is very much to say, give them all the opportunity and all the good will flourish from that, and curriculum-centered education that says, no, the job of education is to get the knowledge and the values into the new generation. And in a sense, you can say that's a kind of paradox, or it's an unresolved, because it goes back and forth. It's a bit a matter of fashion. When you look at schools in the Netherlands at the moment, you get all these new schools that also, we need to give children the space to discover and set their own learning goals, and we shouldn't interfere with that. And then you have people say, no, school is about the transmission of knowledge, and this is the knowledge, and they should know that, and we should push and test. And you can say it's a paradox, but you can also say it's actually a very unhelpful choice that's being presented there. Because if you only have development, but without any content, it can go in any direction. So that's not education. If you only have a list of all the stuff you want to put into the new generation, and are only concerned about that, but not about the new generation, that's also not proper education. So that already suggests that you need the two together in some way. And this is an old idea. John Dewey wrote a book called The Child and the Curriculum, where he already says it needs both. And just to think that we only need children he calls it a really stupid idea. So I quote that as well. But I also think, just thinking about knowledge transmission is also really stupid. So you want to create an opportunity for the new generation to live their own lives. But that doesn't mean that you get into these romantic ideas where you say, it's all growth and development, and the more they can play and discover, the better it will be. Because the life and the playing and the discovery takes place in the real world. And that world makes a lot of things possible. We can lead fantastic lives where we are, but it also puts constraints and limitations on us. And that's, I think, the main point of this idea, even of world-centered education, that we acknowledge that in all education, we can say we welcome the new generation into this world, but this world is real. And sustainability is a really good example of if we don't acknowledge that, if we just think, well, the world is partly just a resource for us, and partly a dumping ground for all the rubbish we produce, then we do not engage with the reality of the world. And there is where I would sort of resolve the paradox by saying, yes, our job is always to give the new generation the best opportunity for their own lives, for their own freedom. But that freedom is not the neoliberal freedom of shopping, of just getting what you want, but it is to encounter a world, a social world, a natural world that's real, and that puts limitations on what we can do. And to work in that, I think, is profoundly educational, but I would also say that's pretty urgent in our time, because we, for a long time, have not acknowledged that the planet puts limitations on us and that we need to come to terms with that. I see the same problem in democratic societies, where more and more everyone just wants to do their own thing and sees every other human being as a hindrance to that. So for me, these, you can say they are educational problems, but at a bigger scale, we are facing them as very urgent problems in our, maybe, what is it, our stage of civilization.
Yeah, I wrote you already that the last time I talked to Marcia Björnerud, I asked her, so it's quite a grim picture that she's sketching as a geoscientist. And I asked her, what is for you, do you think is the most important thing that we need to do? And she thinks on the long term. And I expected something like we need to, I don't know, use this technology or have this intervention. And she said educating girls and women.
Yeah.
So I want to ask you to what kind of education do we just, if we just focus on the, because there are many other aspects, of course, like developing as a person and other aspects of education, but just in the world-centered education, in a world where we need to intervene, we need to change something radically as human beings on a fundamental level. What are some of the concrete approaches in education that we could take?
So before we go to the concrete one, I think there is sort of a principle behind it that's really important. And it has something to do with a kind of sensitivity or awareness. And in English, I would say an awareness that the world is real. So for me, the question of what is real is actually the central question here. And I think that problems with the environmental crisis have a lot to do with our inability, maybe as a culture, to engage with what is real, because what is real always puts limits upon us. And then there is a beautiful Dutch word, which I think you cannot play with that in the way in which it works in Dutch. It's called realiteitszin. And realiteit is reality. And zin means both, you can say, sense, so a sense of reality, but it also means an appetite for reality. It's a positive desire to want to engage with something. And there, I think I would, identify really important quality to work on. How can you make sure that in schools and education, students meet reality? And reality, well, the main definition of real is that it's not what we thought it would be or wanted it to be. And how can we then encourage and help the new generation to stay with that difficulty? So to have an appetite for engaging with that difficulty. That for me would be sort of the central principle in world-centered education. And there I would say it has a lot to offer for the whole question of sustainability and the question of democracy. And you start doing that in simple ways. I often talk about the importance of the crafts, working with what in the English curriculum used to be called resistant materials.
Yeah.
Wood, metal, clay, stone. Those are really important encounters where you meet a reality that is what it is. And of course, you can build with clay, but you cannot do anything with clay. So you have to begin to figure out, what does the clay allow me to do? And I think those are very important sort of educational experiences. So if education is only textual, or if it's only virtual, then you precisely miss the encounter with the real. And I often think if Donald Trump had only worked a bit more with clay when he was younger, then maybe we had a different world, because he's a prime example of someone who just doesn't get reality.
Yeah. Well, maybe this is a good transition to just kind of seeing if we can follow Plato's allegory, and maybe you can use it to make clear, where you agree, but especially also where you disagree. Because if I look at, Donald Trump is just an effect of our society and embodies something that is everywhere. And I like this description of what we don't really know what's real, because we live in a kind of fantasy. We live like we're apart from nature, and we can have unlimited growth, and you can have all your desires fulfilled, and you can have whatever you want in a material way. And now the earth is speaking back to us, like Latour also says, like we used to see it as a stage on which the human drama plays out, but now it's starting to make itself known. So that sounds like a description of the shadows, like the initial condition where they're watching the shadows, but they don't really know what's real.
So the interesting thing about the cave allegory is that Plato frames it in terms of truth, not what is real, but what is true. And I think there is an interesting issue there, because in all these discussions about truth, which have been important discussions also in the philosophy of science and in political theory, if you do not connect the question of what's true to the question of what's real, then you can end up in this bizarre relativistic universe of post-truth, where you say, well, all knowledge is just a matter of opinion, and it's a battle of the strongest opinion. So I also see that as an example of where the question of the real has disappeared. Now, how that fits with Plato, I wonder what you think about that. Where sort of the real, there is of course also a question about what is real and what is just image.
So for instance, they see a shadow of let's say something scary, I don't know, a lion. But this for them, we can say it's a shadow of a lion. For them, it's a lion. So we can say, well, the lion is not real, but their fear, they have actual fear when they see that lion. So it doesn't mean that's what I always try to remind people, is that, well, what the shadow realm, people have the tendency to project it on others. They say, well, they live in the shadow realm, or they're influenced by mass media or whatever. No, it's just like how you and me are speaking here. There's nothing wrong with the shadow realm. I mean, depending on how your life goes, if you have a good life, it's a good place. If you have a bad life, it's a bad place. And I think because he goes, he or she or they go up and they have a journey, and then they come back, and then they're in the same place, but they're not in the same place. So when they come back, they have clearer distinction of, okay, it's not that these shadows no longer exist, because those shadows are there. But they say, oh, that's a shadow that looks like a lion because it's being projected by this statue and this whole story. But so this is just, let's say, the initial condition is that they're in sitting there in the cave, and they're watching the shadows, and there's a shadow of a lion, and they get scared and they don't know it. But then I had to think of that because you describe education as an interruption, because they're unchained, but they don't want to. And they're kind of dragged up to the surface. So it's not very, for the person in question, later they realize, oh, this was actually good. But for the person in question, it's not really pleasant.
There is, that element as well. That quite often, well, I don't know how often, but of course, if as teachers we do our work well, we also confront our students with things that are not easy for them or that they'd rather not engage with. At the personal level, but also just at the simple level of a curriculum of a particular subject. I know from my sort of experience in secondary school, I always liked the first weeks of the school year where you get all these new books and new things. Yeah. But then after a couple of weeks, you begin to realize, oh, I need to stay with it, and there is some hard work to do. And then I often sort of lost interest a little. So you can say that, yeah, the work of education is in that sense interruptive because it steers students in a direction of things they may not have been looking for, or it's not immediately in their sphere of interest, which raises the big question, what justifies the work of teachers to do that, which again is nice in the cave allegory. How do we justify to unchain the people in chains and say, have a look and see what's happening behind you?
So in the beginning, they're released and they're turned around, but their eyes hurt and they're blinded by the fire. They cannot see anything. Yeah. And this person there is maybe, I don't know if it's a good or a bad teacher, but it sounds like a teacher because they're pointing to they're explaining everything to them. Yeah. So they're saying, well, these are the statues. They're more real than the shadows. And all the released prisoner wants to do is they want to go back to their seat because that's reality.
Yeah. And again, there's something, I think really educational there, that if you just sort of turn your student's head or say, look in that direction, if you do not know what you need to see there, you will probably not able to see it. So that's very nice about what's in the allegory, that initially they are unable to see. Partly because the fire is blinding them, and so it's overwhelming. But it points at another issue about teaching, that it's not just about saying to students, look there, but it's also then you can say, to draw them into that reality so that they can begin to see something. It's a very, Kierkegaard actually talks about this, where he says, teaching is double truth giving. So if we just say teaching is transmission knowledge to students, you can do that, but if they cannot recognize it as knowledge, there is no point in doing it, other than that they can maybe repeat it, but they have no idea what they are repeating. So the real job is not just to give students something, but also to give them a frame within which that begins to make sense. And that's a far more difficult thing to do. And some teachers are good at it, and some teachers are rubbish at it. They can talk about mathematics for hours, but they can never get sort of their students into their own mathematical world. So that's, I think, that's also in Plato's allegory. But there is, if I can do one more thing here.
Yeah, sure.
One problem is, of course, that you can use the allegory to criticize the allegory and say, okay, so someone is taken out of the change and is allowed to view what's going on behind the scenes. But then that person can ask, well, wait a minute, is this really going on, or is this another projection of another projection somewhere? That you can say is the problem when you, let's make it big, think about our lives as human beings, just in terms of, you can say, viewing the world, understanding the world, gaining knowledge about the world. That you always end up with this sort of epistemological uncertainty that you can say, okay, I've changed my perspective, but wait a minute, maybe this is also just a perspective and there is another perspective waiting around the corner. So the other thing I do in the book is to say there's actually another question, and that's not the question, what can be or should be my view of the world or my perspective on the world and what's the best perspective. But there is a question that goes in the opposite direction. What is the world asking of me? And I find that a very interesting question, and also a more educational question, where you see your job as educator is not to give your students a particular perspective, but actually to try to make them sensitive for all the questions that are coming in their direction. Like the world that is speaking back to us and saying, wait a minute, you need to care for me, otherwise I will fall apart very soon.
Yeah, so what is the world asking of you? I'm again thinking about geology, because a lot of people who maybe study geology, they work the oil industry is full of geologists. So I was just thinking of that as an example of, you can teach something, all the skills and all the knowledge that you can give, but then what do they do of it? And what is the world asking for them? Is the world asking them to have more oil, so maybe let's say their society gets richer, or we can do all the things that we want? Or is it asking something else of you?
Yeah, and you can even say, so it's never black and white, but sometimes it's nice to have another question. So if you are a good geologist, you can become more sensitive to all the complexities of what you're doing, and that can help you to much better understand what the questions are that you're actually encountering there.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, then you can also think of that knowledge in pure technological terms and say, this is just knowledge that allows me to pursue anything I want to do. So if I want more oil, I now know how to do it. But you can also say, well, if I really understand where oil comes from, that it's a limited resource, then maybe you can begin to see, wait a minute, this technological knowledge also confronts me with the limitations. I think the same experience in the medical domain, that with each new technology, you have almost sort of a new ethical dilemma coming with it. Is this technology, should it be used for what ends? What are the limitations? Keep being able to extend people's lives. What actually does it mean to lead a life well? Is that only a matter of longer and more, or you know those questions probably.
So if we now the next stage would be when the person goes past the fire into the surface, and that's when they're finally he says, well, finally they're happy to be where they are for the first time, and they can also see that I guess this is also the frame that you're talking about, because now they're able to put the frame on what happened before and the whole thing. But I think also one thing that Heidegger really emphasizes in his reading of the cave is the importance of time, because again, in the surface they're blinded again, and it will take time for them to adjust their eyesight. And time is a very limited resource in our society. I mean, you can't even call it a resource. So there we can go different directions with this. I mean, I'm reminded of how you describe school also not just as a place or a space, but also as a time. And there's also the idea of givenness that.
So it's indeed funny. This is often what we promise our students, where we say, well, now it's hard, but once you've gone through that, you will be very happy.
Yeah.
And sometimes that's true. Sometimes that happiness is there for a short period. I think, many people have this experience. You work hard for something, finally you're there, and you think, well, is this everything? From the past, it looks far more exciting than where I'm suddenly find myself in that situation. Like doing a PhD, for example. You work years and years and years, and you think, well, then I will be a doctor, and suddenly you're there, and it doesn't feel different at all. So there is this question of you can say the promise of happiness. And I think there is a danger there. So as an educator, I would say that that's quite a misleading metaphor. We say if we give our students the real understanding that will make them happy.
Yeah, and promise them at one point everything will fall into place, and you realize everything, and you understand everything.
Yeah. And this is one way in which in education people think about emancipation, where they say, students start with limited and blinded and distorted views about themselves and the world. And if we just work and give them the real story about how everything really is, then it will liberate them. And it changes things, but I don't think that is the way of emancipation, to become liberated from sort of wrong or limited or distorted ideas and end up in a situation where everything is clear and undistorted and no longer ideological. So that promise, I think, we cannot deliver, and there may be a problem there in the allegory, that if that promise is on the horizon, that promise itself is maybe a lie, if we can use that word. It makes you also wonder about then coming back into the cave and what happens there.
But that's the next stage, right? Because they don't stay there.
Well,
they go back into the cave. That's I guess this was the question I was most looking forward to asking, because it's not I mean, if you would know all this in advance, you wouldn't go to that school if you want to be successful in society, because they're on the surface, they get everything, they're happy, and then they go back into the cave. Their eyes are not adjusted to the darkness anymore. So all the games they play, so all the successes in life, they're not good at it anymore. People make fun of them. They say, well, you've just ruined your eyesight. And if they want to show them, but look what I've shown, then they try to kill them, of course. Plato is also speaking about Socrates and what happened to him. But I was just because if you speak about world-centered education, here is a case of someone who has at least realized something that maybe the others in the society didn't realize, and they go back, but it makes them actually less successful. They can't use it. And I really like that, because I like that idea, because they've realized something. Let's say they've had this courage to embrace something truthful. And it's so deep that he says he would rather be like a poor peasant at the surface than the most successful person in that society. But it's not. I guess maybe this is about the relationship between education and society. And is it the job of education to make people successful and perform? And that's why parents want their children to go to a good school, so they'll at least they'll have a choice if they want to be a lawyer or politician or whatever.
Again, I think there's a big educational theme there, where you can say education that really changes you, that's education where there is no way back. And that can be a good thing, but it can also mean that if you want to go back to the easier life without the difficult questions, or the adjusted life, that's no longer an option, because you will also know that there is a wider frame or a different possibility, which again makes the whole question of how do we justify education quite a big one, because even if we do it with good intentions, we interfere in lives in a way that cannot be reversed. And I think, here you find the bigger political questions around education. There's a lovely distinction it comes from Britain, mid-19th century, where you had a whole movement of self-emancipation of the lower classes. And they said, in school we get useful knowledge, but what we really want, they called it really useful knowledge. And they said useful knowledge is the knowledge that allows you to do a job and earn an income and be a good citizen. But the really useful knowledge is the knowledge where you see that the boss of the factory is making far more profit out of your labor than that you are. So the whole question of whether knowledge and education can emancipate and what that means is a big question. I don't think that as educators we can give our students this promise that we will emancipate them. What I do in the book instead is I sort of approach that from the opposite angle, where I say our responsibility as educators is to give the new generation, the children that are born in the world, a fair chance at their own freedom, their own existence as subject of their own life. And there is an emancipatory sort of discussion in the background, because when I look at modern societies, to a large extent, they are not interested in people who are critical or who think. To a large extent, societies are interested in people who buy a lot so that the economy keeps growing, who behave well so that we don't get people protesting on the streets against injustices. So we have a society that I think is interested in people being objects, you could say, rather than subjects. And there, I would say, as educators, we need to step in and say, no, everyone deserves a chance to be a subject of their own life and use their freedom well, and not be immediately sucked into being a good consumer. I mean, it's a silly idea to be a good consumer, but I think if you look at all the social media and the advertising that goes straight into young children's lives, they're constantly being told, be a good consumer, buy this identity, buy that stuff. And the sooner and the more, the better.
Yeah.
And there I also connect it to the time of the school, where I say, do we still as a society create sort of little places and moments where we try to disconnect the new generation from all these pushes and pulls and all these seductions, so that they can, and again, there is something Platonic here, so that they can have a perspective on this and do not think that that world is the only possible world.
But then there's also a problem because the schools are funded and determined and set up by, let's say, the society, the politics, right? And if I look at the Netherlands, but I think it's in many countries, it's this way how they look at it, as first of all, you need basic skills or the skills for the profession that you're studying at. So if you anyway, I don't need to explain it. That's clear. That's why you go to school, to learn stuff about this field. And then we also want to have this sense of tradition, of values, we want to, so there's even in the Netherlands a political party that wants to start their own school because they have a different idea about our history and what's important in our history and which values should be transferred.
Yeah.
And so far we've managed to avoid to speak about the distinction that you're most famous for, I think, between qualification and socialization, which are these two. And then the third one is subjectification. How you describe it is so you start with the basic skills, then you also want to have them function in society, socialized, let's say. And if there's time, you can also focus on having them discover themselves or be autonomous students. And your proposal is to reverse this order, right? In priority.
So, I make this joke where I say, okay, even people who are in favor of a broad conception of educational quality, very quickly that you're sucked into say, we have to start with the knowledge because that's the basis, the knowledge and skills. And then, of course, the values and the traditions and practices. And then my ironic point is, and if there is time left, then we can maybe be interested in the student as person and in their own freedom. But when you put it like that, I always hope that people immediately see there's actually something silly there, because you are not just putting knowledge into a robot. There are real human beings there leading beautiful, difficult, messy, fantastic lives. And we want them to become more knowledgeable, more skillful. We want them to have a sense of orientation. And we care about their lives. So in that sense, you can say the whole question of how they can exist as subject should always be at the heart of everything. And even this whole reference to the basics is, politicians do it again and again, and I don't understand how they always get away with it, where they say the basics first, and the basics are reading and writing, and arithmetic or science or something like that. They forget that reading and writing are highly complex and highly political activities. I was just referring to that in a little piece where I say, look at Salman Rushdie and you see that writing is not a skill, not a cognitive motor skill. Writing is a political act with huge consequences. But also a society in which everyone can read and write and count, but where no one cares about the environment or other people or democracy. I would say that's not a society that has the basics right. So it's quite remarkable that, as I said, politicians always get away with saying, the basics first, and everyone get in panic and say, reading, writing. Very strange.
Yeah, and I like how you want, I think the second chapter is called so we can ask what is the school that society needs, but you ask what is the society that the school needs.
Yeah.
And I've talked about it in other episodes as well, but I'm an assistant professor educational research, but I'm highly, highly critical of the education system. Sometimes that I don't even know, does it make any sense what I do, because I see so many good ideas, your ideas as well, but the system is so political and economic, and so we inherent, so education is about transferring whatever knowledge, skills, other parts as well, but we also transfer the idea of what education is, what the school is. So our politicians and our leaders, they have gone to school themselves. They haven't experienced another kind of school, which is maybe an argument for Plato's idea that we need to have this special training or something. But it just makes me wonder what you are proposing. If you were able to bring into practice this idea, Is that possible within the current education system, or would you need to start from the ground up?
So I'm inclined to say it's possible. Also because what I'm proposing is not, well, in one sense, I think it's very radical, but in another sense, it's going for, you can say, the third way or the middle between this pendulum, the people who say it's all about the student and the child, or it's all about the curriculum. So we have everything we need in front of us. The question is what we do with it. So in that sense, I would say it's not that we need to destroy all school buildings and all the laws and start from scratch. I think this idea of world-centered education, which implies a profound critique of child and student-centered education, a profound critique of curriculum and knowledge-centered education. But it can be done within, I would say, that the structures, the infrastructure we have. So without sort of even suggesting that I'm fantastic, I do world-centered education every day. I do it in highly performative universities, but even those, I think, provide opportunities for doing something else, something more meaningful. The only thing I can say is that you need to have an awareness of what you're doing and why you're doing things differently. And one worry I have is, as you said, a lot of people get educated in these systems. That gives them a sense of what education is, and they just reproduce that. Which is another argument for coming back to where we started, why education deserves much better theory, much more thoughtfulness, in order to see what are we really doing, what is essential, what actually is not that important, what matters, what doesn't matter.
Can you give an example of what is it that you do different, or what is different about being in your classroom, a world-centered education versus another classroom?
I think, what shall I say there? It's quite interesting to speak about your own work as an educator, because there's always a trap that the story you tell is better than what you actually do. So, but let's try. I think for me, the most important thing sort of in my awareness as teacher is I always want to confront, but that does not necessarily need to look sort of very confrontational. My students with their own freedom, and when needed, I also want to make their, I would say, their infantile desires visible to them. And for me, these are two sides of the same coin. I think infantile desires or infantile ways of being is where you never raise questions about your own desires and think that other people can solve your problems for you. And I meet that a lot in higher education, particularly in Britain, where students now, when they are from the UK, have to pay already £10,000 a year just to sit in a lecture theatre. They haven't eaten anything or they had a place to stay. For students they used to be called international students, but it's now everyone from outside of the UK. They have to pay £24,000 a year just to have the privilege of meeting lecturers. So they very quickly are pushed in a kind of consumer position where they say, look, I've paid for it, so it's your job as a tutor or a lecturer to make sure that I succeed. Yeah. So giving me a low mark is not an option for you because we've paid for it. And of course you understand that, but those are, sort of infantile ideas that you want to interrupt. So I encounter that as well. To always sort of remind students of their own freedom doesn't mean that we sit together and that I tell them you are free human beings. I do that by actually putting the world in front of them, giving them tasks that are specific, concrete, often not immediately motivating or nice, and never what they say that they want. And for me, those are all qualities of world-centered education, where even in a classroom setting, you try to give your students things where it's not just a task, where you say, here's a book and here are the 10 questions on which you will be examined, but where you say, here is a book and I have no questions as teacher, but in 3 weeks, I want you to come up with 10 questions about the book. And those are little things where you say it's not just that you can read the book and can reproduce and can memorize it, but where I would say, here's a book and the book has its own integrity and it's for you now to come into a relationship with the book. For me, these are all qualities of what I would say, what I do in a world-centered way in my teaching, which is always to say there is something here that is real and that deserves attention, and where I sort of point in the direction of my students and say, and you have a job here to do as well, and I cannot tell you entirely what that job is. I'm pretty confident that students get a lot out of that. So it's not a form of therapy where I want to be difficult for my students and hope that they become resilient. I think I would almost say that's nonsense. So the book matters and the stuff they encounter in the book. And when I work with teachers in professional development programs, the stuff they engage with is also important for them in terms of the content. But it always has this extra layer where I say, I'm not here to tell you what you will get out of it, but there is a job for you to encounter it. And that you can say these are very minor things, but when you work with that kind of awareness as a teacher, I think it creates significantly different educational situations and trajectory.
So then this kind of education would be possible in the current system if the teachers have a kind of education as well, so to speak.
Yeah, so teachers need to know what they're doing, and again, I would say that's why theory is important, so that you can begin to see what are we actually doing. And you need a bit of courage, but yeah, just a little bit. But I think the most important thing is that you have a sense of what you're doing and why you're doing it. And then you begin to push back against the system in order to see how resilient the system is. And a lot of education systems are not very resilient. They fall apart when you push in the right spot.
Yeah. One of the most difficult things I find if I'm asked to design like a course or something like that is that I have to write this document where I specify the learning goals, because especially because my teachings are usually around philosophy, and if not, I try to put something in there. How do I know what they're going to learn or what they want to learn?
You can't, yeah. So either then you leave those sections blank and see what happens, or you write something that is true but so complicated that the bureaucrats don't know what to do. And I've used different strategies where, for example, in the box learning outcomes, I said in this course, I take a virtue-based approach, and therefore it's impossible to identify learning outcomes. But I can describe the person qualities that I want to explore with my students. So there's text there, but you say, look, learning outcomes is a silly idea, but I have something better here. I can tell you why I'm doing what I'm doing. But I also, I had great joy developing and teaching a program where there was no assessment. And when we were developing it, most of our colleagues said, you can't do that. You will not be allowed to do that. And we found a gap in the system that did allow us to do that. And again, I would say it created, much more significant education where students also said, this is much better. We want more of this. So that makes me optimistic, but it's little steps. But I am, more, I would rather sabotage the system than that I would try to change the system, because that's an impossible task.
Yeah.
To take on a whole system. But you can find the gaps where there's movement possible.
I think one of the things that this shows that this is possible is that the school is not the building or the papers that tell you, what are you going to do in this class and everything. So one of the other things we can relate to Greek is skola.
Yeah.
The word school from skola, and of course it's one of the first things if you are being taught ancient Greek is what they tell you is that school actually means free time.
Yes,
which is very funny for the students at that. Yeah. What is your idea about school? What is it if it's not the building, if it's not the whole apparatus and the logistics around it? What is the essence of?
So for the essence, I would go back indeed to the Greek word, and nowadays we have silly ideas about free time because we think free time is leisure time where you can do what you want. And I would read that differently by saying free time is, you can say, time that is not yet claimed by others. It's time that's not yet determined in terms of what should happen there. You can almost say free time is emancipated time. It's time set free from, say, the logic of work or the logic of usefulness or the logic of production or all these things that societies want from schools as well. I often tell this story where I say the school comes out of a double history. So one history is where you say when modern societies evolve, they lose their educative power. So when you grow up on a farm, you learn everything you need to know to become a farmer, and it's easy and clear. But when work moves to factories or offices, then by just hanging around, the next generation doesn't pick up what it needs to know, and you also see the requirements for knowledge and skills become more specialistic. So then the school emerges, and you can say the school has a job to do for society. And I want to take that seriously because I think, that's part of why we have schools. There's nothing wrong with that. But I then always say that's one history of the school. And there is this other, much older history of school as schola, as precisely the time outside of work, the time outside of all the demands from society. Partly the challenge for the school is how to stand within these two histories, to know that as a school you have a job to do, but also have to take care of this free time. And I think that has become more difficult nowadays with so much expectation from society. I also think that free time has become much more important in our times. because society is so omnipresent with all of its demands and all of its seductions. So I was talking about, being a good consumer, or all the identity options that are constantly bombarding young people via social media. And
We're sorry to interrupt. We did an episode on Bernard Stiegler with Daniel Ross. So that very much connects to that the next move of capitalism was to start to, let's say, cultivate this free time, offering options what to do, and so that it also becomes the free time is leisure time, and it also becomes a resource.
Yeah, you can say what it does there is to constantly try to distract human beings from their own existence as subject. I think the economic sphere and advertising is a good example of that. Populist politics does the same by saying all these promises. If you vote for me, I'll give you everything you want. And of course, we know that that's never going to happen. So we live in societies that tell us constantly desire more. There are no limits, and very quickly you can say that begins to undermine your ability to stand there as subject and consider where you are in relation to it. And for me, that's a very important argument for saying we need to free up time, first of all, for the new generation, this free time of the school, so that we, as I put it in the book, give them a fair chance at their own life as subject, and that they are not constantly sort of completely washed away by all the impulses and everything that's constantly bombarding them. So for me, that's also the argument for the second history of the school, that if we do not give that time to the new generation, we are actually throwing them on the street almost when they are born. And when you have it as that image, you see how dangerous that is, and how it undermines their possibilities to step into their own lives, I would say. Now, whether the school as a system can still do this, I think that's a really big question. To tell a minister of education that the school is also there to waste money, to waste time, to do things where we do not know what will come out of it, is a difficult message. And it's really important to say why it's an important message and why that is part of what we should do with the monies we invest in the school. And then if the school can no longer do that, are there other places where that can happen? I already mentioned this distinction between useful knowledge and really useful knowledge. And the movement is called the Chartists. And these were people who said our education system no longer gives us the free time we need for our own emancipation. So they started Sunday schools where they said Sunday is the only free time, and we're going to claim that for our education. And I find that such an interesting historical example.
Yeah. But those are examples still of a group organizing that, needing to have the resources and everything. So it's they create another institution, let's say. And I'm very interested in this idea that if education and school, the true meaning of, or the deeper meaning of school, is so fundamental that ideally it would take place in school, but it's not. The school doesn't have a monopoly on schola. And I'm interested in how in other areas of life you can have this as well.
Yeah.
Of course, I have to say we're very privileged. We live in rich countries, and so you need to have some basics as well. But once you have these basics, not saying this because this is a podcast, but podcasts are a way in which people can have access to something for free. You can, reading is different. If you listen to a podcast of an hour, you need to use this hour and while you're doing something else. Now, I'm wondering on your vision, and how is an institution a necessary condition for education to take place?
I'm inclined to jump on the word institution, because I think that's precisely the difference between an institution and a function.
Yeah.
So if the school becomes entirely functional, it just does a job for society. But I think good institutions always have this protective quality, where they say, yeah, we need to organize something to help ourselves to be better. So yeah, it then is the question: if the school is no longer the one who is interested or can create this free time, how then do we do it? We can do it individually. So I really like the other question you sent about what does it mean to be a student? And there is something there where you can, maybe my first answer to the question, how to be a student, would be, well, you have to claim free time. You have to say, not this is sort of my time that is in my possession, but where you say, here is an other kind of time that I'm now going to use to do something where I do not know where it will lead.
Yeah.
So a student, you can make the case for free time. I'm also thinking about the Grundtvig and the tradition of study circles and adult education in Denmark, which is a real sort of societal movement where adults said, we still want this free time, and we're going to get together to make sure that we have this free time also in relation to our working life, so that it's not just the free time for the preparation for the children, but that actually we need this time throughout our lives. And I think, the People's University and those kind of movements have come out of that. And these are examples to find bottom-up forms to claim this time again for your own education.
Yeah. And what about the idea of, I think there's also like a school which is called the School of Life, but I mean, the idea that, well, actually, this is one idea I subscribe to, is that, let's say, the nature of life on Earth is you can have give many names to it.
Mm-hmm.
What are we here to do? And one that is closest to my heart is to say life is a school. Yeah. And then it becomes the question, what is a school? And then there also in society, ideally you have schools, but it doesn't mean you only learn in that school, but though, relationships can be a type of school, can be. Not necessarily if you have relationships, you're in school, because that relates to what you say about, well, it's not just about learning. No. But it's about, once you have this idea of subjectification, that just to give one example, because I talked to Mika Ball before, who really emphasizes also taking time with art. So one of the things you can do is go to a museum and just sit in front of a painting, but sit there for 1 hour and see what happens. Yeah. That for me would be, this is what I did in my holiday, because I wanted to try it out. And because I don't know anything about art, I think, okay, what do I get? And I felt there was something happening there, But of course, there was not a teacher, unless you see maybe Rembrandt as a teacher.
Mm-hmm. So if I tie a couple of things together, I would say a student for me is someone who is willing to be taught. And that's very different than to say a student is someone who is willing to learn. Because if you're willing to be taught, you say, I'm open to the possibility that something comes to me that is outside of my control and my choice, but that may speak to me in good ways or in troubling ways. And that's why I don't like the phrase lifelong learning, because that can be also abused in all kinds of ways. I think lifelong learning in most countries now means the lifelong duty for the lower classes to pay for their own upskilling and employability.
Yeah, and keeping up with developments in society, and yeah.
But if you say, so lifelong learning is a duty we put on some people, whereas if you talk about, permanent education, you can say, well, education should be a right throughout our lives. But for me to be a student is, to open you up to the possibility that something may teach you. And then I think if you are able to spend an hour with one painting, it may begin to speak to you in all kind of ways that you didn't expect. So you need to give it that time. And then I think, so life as a school or the world as a school, I would always approach that from life teaches us things. And in that sense, there is this, scholastic quality in life as well. But then we need to not be there as a learner who constantly wants to gather and learn more stuff, but we need to give it time so that things can happen to us. The arts can do that. I'm quite close to music, and what I like about music is music takes its own time. So you can say, okay, I'll play this Beethoven piece twice as fast because, well, then it's over, but then it's no longer that piece. So that already helps you to get into a different time. And visual arts can also, draw you into a different time. And I think there's something very educational and very political there.
And what about nature? Just going out. I'm just trying to see how far I can, how far you push the idea of education. Can a forest teach you something?
Yes. So I'm not a foresty person, but I read a nice piece this weekend of someone who said that if you give something attention, it begins to open up itself. And her example was paying attention to birds and bird song.
Yeah.
And she moved from a city to a farm, and then someone said, well, pay attention to the birds. And over time, that became a whole universe that she never was aware of. So it can happen with nature as well, but it's not yet where I am in my my school of life to put it in that way.
Yeah. Maybe if you have this, because you said that this double truth, so you need also kind of a frame. So if you go with a guide or something in nature, they can of course, hey, listen to this and point you to distinctions and everything like that.
Yeah, and that's that's quite fascinating. Where someone else sort of tries to introduce you in what they are able to observe, what they are able to see, and that's a basic educational gesture. Right?
Well, thanks so much for this conversation. Maybe the final question is because different people listen to this podcast who are not necessarily in education. Why would your book be interesting for them?
I think partly because it asks some very basic questions, but what I also hope is that the book sort of opens sort of I would say the beautiful complexity of education, that there is so much happening in what we think that we already know, and that there are so many fascinating questions to ask and observations to make. So for me, it would be like if I would go into a wood with someone who knows all about birds, and suddenly I realized, look, there is a completely different wood here, but it has never been on my radar. And I just hope that some people, when they read the book, they say, wait a minute, there is a whole educational universe here that I wasn't aware of. That I would be very pleased if something like that would happen.
Yeah, me too. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot.
And thank you for listening. This is an independent educational podcast. You can support me through Patreon or go to livefromplatoscave.com for other ways to support the production of this podcast.